For decades after the war, Japan did something rare. It didn't just grow fast, it grew predictably. Year after year, factories expanded, exports rose, living standards improved. And slowly, almost unnoticed, success began to set rules, not laws, expectations, about how firms should behave, about what workers could rely on, about what change was supposed to look like. Those expectations made stability feel natural and made deviation feel risky long before anyone called it a problem. Japan's post-war recovery was dramatic. In a single generation, the country moved from devastation to industrial powerhouse. Growth was steady, employment was secure, firms expanded together rather than cutting each other down. That pattern repeated, and repetition trained behavior. Workers came to expect long careers in one company. Firms came to expect loyal labor. Banks came to expect long-term relationships. Policymakers came to expect exports to keep rising. This consistency mattered. It shaped what people believed was normal and what they believed was dangerous. Deviation didn't look innovative, it looked unnecessary. By the 1960s and 70s, Japan's economy offered more than growth. It offered security, layoffs were rare, firms absorbed shocks internally, workers repaid that protection with loyalty and restraint. This was not enforced by law, it was enforced socially. Breaking expectations carried costs. A firm that cut workers risked reputation. A worker who left too easily raised doubts. Stability became a shared obligation. That obligation reduced appetite for disruption. Experimentation was no longer just an economic decision, it was a social one, and social costs accumulate quietly. As the system kept working, alternatives didn't disappear overnight, they faded. Entrepreneurial risk existed, but mostly inside large firms. Failure became less tolerated, not because Japan feared change, but because success had raised the standard for acceptable outcomes. Success narrowed imagination. If the model worked, why replace it? If firms were stable, why restructure? If exports grew, why gamble? Each year of continuity quietly removed another option. The economy did not become rigid overnight, it became confident. And confidence closed paths it no longer needed, until it did. By the late 1970s, expectations had hardened. Policymakers learned to prefer gradualism. Banks learned to protect relationships. Firms learned to avoid visible failure. None of this felt like weakness. It felt like maturity. But the stronger the expectation, the higher the cost of breaking it. Change now threatened trust, not just profits. Japan's success did not eliminate risk. It stored it inside shared assumptions. If an entire system agrees on what stability looks like, what happens when adaptation begins to feel like betrayal? If this way of understanding history, through expectations, incentives, and quiet trade-offs, feels intuitive to you, this channel is built around that lens. As expectations hardened, Japan's economy began to converge around one dominant model. It was not imposed, it emerged because it kept winning. Large firms anchored production, banks provided long-term finance, government agencies coordinated quietly, workers committed to stable careers. Each part reinforced the others. Capital flowed through established relationships. Labor stayed where skills were accumulated. Firms planned years ahead instead of reacting quickly. The system didn't need constant adjustment, it reinforced itself. But reinforcement carried an assumption that the environment would remain legible, familiar, and stable. The more the model succeeded, the less tolerance there was for deviation. Efficiency increased, flexibility quietly declined. At the center of this alignment were Keiretsu-style ties. Firms held shares in one another. Suppliers and manufacturers coordinated closely. Banks sat at the center, monitoring performance over time. This structure reduced volatility. Companies were shielded from hostile takeovers. Managers were insulated from short-term pressure. Losses could be absorbed without public failure. The system stopped asking, "Is this firm profitable this year?" It asked, "Is this firm stable over time?" That encouraged patience. It also suppressed exit. Poor performance was cushioned rather than corrected. Leaving the system became socially and financially costly. Stability protected firms, but it also locked them in. Banks did more than lend. They acted as shock absorbers. When firms struggled, loans were rolled over. Temporary weakness was treated as a shared problem, not an individual failure. This preserved jobs, suppliers, and relationships. Inside the system, this was rational behavior. Forcing failure would have rippled outward. Support kept the structure intact, but losses did not disappear. They accumulated. Adjustment was delayed, not resolved. Balance sheets thickened quietly with unresolved risk. The system smoothed shocks in the present by carrying them into the future. As long as growth continued, this remained invisible. Export growth reinforced alignment even further. Strong performance abroad validated coordination at home. Success became proof that the system was still correct. Exports justified long-term lending. Lending justified stable employment. Stability justified gradual policy. Diversity of strategy declined, not because it was forbidden, but because it looked unnecessary. But export success reflected yesterday's advantages. Signals lagged underlying change. The system learned to trust feedback that arrived late. Confidence grew just as conditions began to shift. By the early 1980s, alignment was deep. Firms shared similar strategies. Banks shared similar exposures. Workers shared similar expectations. Conflict was low. Failure was rare. Slack had been removed. When slack disappears, adjustment becomes discontinuous. Small changes require large responses. Experimentation becomes dangerous because there is no safe margin for error. Alignment is powerful, but it narrows the range of acceptable responses. When an entire system is built to repeat success, what happens when success no longer behaves the way it used to? By the mid-1980s, Japan did not feel like an economy in trouble. Growth had slowed, but living standards were high. Firms were stable. Unemployment remained low. Compared to more volatile systems, Japan looked calm and controlled. That calm mattered. Adaptation usually begins when pressure feels immediate. In Japan, pressure felt distant. The system still delivered security, profits, and international success. Strength reduced urgency, but waiting changes the kind of change required. Pressure does not disappear. It accumulates quietly until adjustment is no longer smooth. What looked like stability was also delay. As growth slowed, weaknesses became visible. Banks did not respond by forcing restructuring. They rolled over loans. They extended credit. They avoided exits. This was rational behavior inside the system. Forcing failure would have meant layoffs, supplier collapse, and loss of confidence. Banks chose continuity because continuity still seemed affordable. But capital that stays put cannot move. Each rollover tied more resources to existing firms. Capital that could have supported new sectors remained locked in old ones. Reallocation slowed. What looked like patience was also postponement. The system was optimizing for survival, not renewal. Firms adapted to these incentives. If banks protected survival, reinvention became optional. Managers avoided visible losses. Restructuring was delayed. Risk-taking declined. This was not complacency. It was adaptation to incentives. Over time, something deeper changed. Firms began to define success as continuity itself. Maintaining employment, relationships, and reputation mattered more than transformation. Reinvention started to look irresponsible rather than ambitious. Innovation continued, but inside familiar structures. Success froze behavior. Policymakers understood change was coming. They also understood what rapid change could destroy: employment stability, financial confidence, social trust. So they chose gradualism. Reforms were cautious. Adjustments were small. Timelines were long. This worked when shocks were temporary. But structural change is not temporary. Each year of gradualism strengthened existing commitments. Banks extended ties. Firms delayed exits. Workers built expectations. Tools that might have forced adaptation quietly disappeared. Gradualism assumed time was an ally. In reality, time was closing doors. By the late 1980s, success had become a political shield. High asset values signaled strength. Stable employment signaled legitimacy. Export performance signaled competence. Calls for painful reform were easy to dismiss. Why act when the system still looked strong? The economy was not frozen by weakness. It was frozen by legitimacy. That legitimacy removed permission to act. And when legitimacy finally eroded, the space for gradual adjustment was already gone. Choice narrowed before anyone admitted it. If success removes the permission to change, what happens when change arrives anyway? By the time pressure became impossible to ignore, Japan no longer had the freedom to respond cleanly. The system still functioned, banks still lent, firms still employed, households still trusted institutions. That was the problem. Painful adaptation no longer looked responsible. It looked destructive. Layoffs threatened social contracts. Bank failures threatened confidence. Firm exits threatened identity. Change now carried a legitimacy cost far larger than its economic cost. Reform did not look like leadership. It looked like betrayal of a model that had delivered decades of stability. Legitimacy, once lost, could not be selectively restored. The miracle had not failed. It had become untouchable. The late 1980s asset bubble did not create Japan's trap. It delayed confronting it. Rising land and stock prices masked deeper problems. Balance sheets appeared strong. Collateral values rose. Firms that should have adjusted looked solvent. The system read these signals as confirmation. Banks extended credit instead of restructuring. Firms borrowed instead of changing. Policymakers delayed instead of forcing exits. The bubble acted like a temporary anesthetic. When it burst, the issue was not shock, it was exposure. After the bubble, Japan faced a reality with no clean sequence. Banks held bad loans tied to firms they could not abandon. Firms depended on banks that could not easily fail. Policymakers depended on both to preserve employment and trust. Each institution was rational. Together, they were trapped. Forcing bank losses threatened firm collapse. Forcing firm exits threatened employment. Protecting employment prolonged financial weakness. There was no move that did not destabilize something else. Entrapment did not come from momentum alone. It came from interdependence. Japan did not experience collapse. Living standards declined slowly. Employment remained relatively stable. Social order held. This made the trap durable. Costs were spread over time. Discomfort replaced crisis. Adjustment happened quietly and incompletely. Comfort reduced urgency just enough to avoid decisive change. The system survived, but it could not reset. Adaptation requires not just capacity, but permission. Japan's institutions retained capacity long after they lost permission. The outcome was not stagnation by accident. It was entrapment by success. The same expectations that once coordinated growth now constrained action. The same legitimacy that protected stability now blocked transformation. Japan was not trapped by decline. It was trapped by a past that still felt valid. When success defines what is acceptable, adaptation becomes illegitimate long before it becomes impossible. If you're drawn to history explained through incentives, alignment, and quiet trade-offs, rather than heroes or collapses, this channel is built around that way of seeing. Systems rarely fail at their weakest point. They fail when their greatest success makes change no longer acceptable.